getting into more kind of policy and planning, we're going to have Moss Driscoll from the Klamath Water Users Association talk a little bit about their planning process for stewardship in the Lost River Basin.
Yeah, great. Can folks hear me?
Yes.
All right, let me just share my presentation. All right, do you see that?
We see slides in the outline mode,
right.
or editing mode.
There we go.
We see your notes version.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay. I think the display settings up at the top, right above your slide. There you go. That's full screen. That's great.
Yeah. Thanks for your patience. And this presentation, I appreciate over the course of the last 2 days, both the technical material and frankly, some of the less technical material. And this definitely falls in that latter camp. And I've also recognized it's late in the day, and so I've tried to put together a presentation here that is picture oriented for your visual appeal, to keep folks entertained. I will give a little bit of intro and background into myself, so you understand where I'm coming from as I talk about this planning process that we're engaged upon. I grew up on a sheep farm in Vermont, and my parents always said they raised grass. We raised grass-fed, all-natural, organic lamb before there was such a thing in the grocery store. And like many of you, I grew up most of my time outside, and at the base of this hill you see here in the picture, there was a small little stream that ran through the woods called Meadowbrook, and I spent a lot of my time with my brothers and my sister creating pools and eddies and removing obstructions and spending our time just playing in the outdoors. That led me to be a biology major and one that was particularly interested in environmental science, and particularly how societies value, and in so valuing, manage wildlife and natural resources available to them. And so I was very interested in ocean work and oceanography, and ultimately through a kind of roundabout way got involved in water law and water management. And I spent my first couple of years in graduate school working in the Colorado Rockies, and working for some of the water conservation districts there and conservation organizations there that were going through a statewide planning process, and really wrestling with the question of, in light of how Colorado, and this was 15, 20 years ago, was going to grow, how are they going to ensure that there was water for the environment, for in-stream flow uses, and to ensure those values that were so valuable to the state, both recreationally and economically. And so a lot of the streams that we were working on, like this one you see here, the Crystal River, which is tributary to the Roaring Fork, which is the main tributary in Colorado to the Colorado outside of the Yampa, we were working to try and get 5-10 cubic feet per second back to the stream system, and primarily through cooperative means with local irrigation entities, irrigation operators, to try and figure out cooperative means to see that water at the right time in the stream for environmental purposes. I had a stint for 2 years, real quickly. Last thing I'll just note is 2 years in the Peace Corps prior to coming to Klamath, and I was working for the National Parks Division there for the Tanzanian government, and working on their their National Marine Park System structure, and one park in particular down in the southern part of the country, Manasseh Bay, which was an incredible place. Some of the highest biodiversity of corals in East Africa, but had a real dependency in terms of the local population on the resource, and extracted it heavily, and extracted it in many cases in damaging ways. At the time, one of the issues we were dealing with was dynamite fishing, a problem that still persists. But we were working on, again, kind of cooperative ways where we could involve the local populace in how to manage and sustainably use, to the extent it could be practically implemented, the local resource. So I came to the Klamath Basin about 12 years ago, working for a stint for the Bureau of Reclamation that lasted about 9 years, until the beginning of this year. And bringing this background, and obviously not native to the basin, and I come from a perspective and an approach where, to understand where we're headed, we have to understand where we've been. That's a kind of a fundamental step. And of course, for our scope of recorded time, it's obviously very limited. This is a map of the basin in 1905, and one of the earliest, comprehensive maps we have. And it's a snapshot in time. It's one thing I'd note. But obviously, we note the tremendous water bodies that existed here. You have Tule Lake dominating the center of the map at over 100,000 acres at times. Lower Klamath, which was a complex of open water and marsh that ranged from about 80,000, about 80,000 acres thereabouts, in terms of the wetted area. And I'm going to tell one quick story here just to explain how we're looking at the system and how it's been altered and how it can be managed potentially into the future. So this is a picture from 1905 of Lower Klamath, and you can see this open water area. It attracted considerable attention for its wildlife values, and some of the early wildlife photography was based here in the basin, and prompted ultimately the establishment of Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. The Bureau of Reclamation Service at the time, they had, of course, plans for draining Lower Klamath and ultimately trying to homestead and farm those lands, and thought this might be of interest to the group. This is actually the current site of Keno Dam, present site of Keno Dam, and the rapids right there at Keno, right around the bend there. And Reclamation's plan was actually to build a tunnel that would outlet water right about where Keno Dam is, having taken water around what has historically been known as Keno Reef, and thereby be able to drop the water level in not only the Klamath River, but all of Lower Klamath Lake, and drain and reclaim those lands. Of course, things turned out differently. Reclamation sent some engineers out there who did some diamond drill samples in the reef at Keno, and realized it was going to be far more expensive to build this tunnel or this channel around the reef than they ever anticipated. As happenstance was, the railroad also came along in 1907, the Southern Pacific Railroad, and said, well, we'll build a dike across Lower Klamath, across the Klamath Straits there, and we'll cut off the river from the lake. And so Reclamation agreed to that, and the dike was built, the levee was built in 1908. And as you see here, here's the original channel of the Klamath Straits as it was being diked in, and a concrete structure being put in what is now the control structure for the 80 headworks. That process was somewhat effective. The gates were closed ultimately in 1917 permanently, and the water drained out of the lake, and the lands were quote unquote reclaimed. And as you see here, from 1924, there were some early attempts to grow barley and oats out there in the reclaimed lands. They also had considerable problems right away in some of the areas that were formerly marshland, and peat would catch on fire, and they had quite a challenge putting out some of those fires as they burned across the landscape. Ultimately, Lower Klamath, as a result of its dewatering, largely became a dust bowl, and particularly with the soil types and the alkaline soils and the potential for salt to damage plant growth. Much has been, as had been feared, the area became a desolate wasteland in much respect, and you had dust storms blowing across Lower Klamath into Merrill and closing down the school. At the same time, in the early 1920s, this was the origins of the conservation movement, and there was a real push to see water brought back to Lower Klamath to preserve its values, particularly for water birds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. The Audubon Society was particularly active at the time in this campaign. That ultimately led to the Secretary of the Interior directing what was then the Bureau of Biological Survey, which is now Fish and Wildlife Service, and Reclamation to jointly study this problem. And a group of engineers were put together from both agencies, and they ultimately came up with a plan that was given the name of the lead engineer who put it together, J.R. Yreka. And the Yreka plan involved putting in dikes around Tule Lake, the remnants of Tule Lake, with the ability to flood certain portions of the former lake bed, what are now sumps 2 and 3, or sorry, yeah, 2 and 3, with a permanent open water area of sump 1A and 1B in Tule Lake, and then a tunnel through the hill, through Sheepy Ridge, over to Lower Klamath to pump excess water to ensure that Tule Lake levels could be managed, in part for botulism, but in part for flood control. And the Bureau of Biological Survey, for their part, they envisioned what they ultimately really constructed at Lower Klamath, which was, a series of diked and celled units that can be managed to move water in and out for the purpose of creating temporary and permanent wetland areas and wetland habitat for waterfowl and shorebirds. And so here's just a current map of the refuge system, and you can see kind of the general unit system that exists. These are, again, 2 former lake beds that have been, essentially reduced to this form of management. That being said, it was very productive, very effective. The development of the Yreka plan, which happened in the early 40s, coincided with the development of the Klamath Project in terms of agriculture in the wake of World War II. But by the 1950s, mid-1950s, when they started waterfowl surveys, for example, in North America, there were over 5 million northern pintails counted in Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge alone. There are today not that many northern pintails in all of North America. This system was altered, obviously, as we just noted, and then re-altered and reconfigured to solve these multiple issues. And I mentioned dust was one of them, dust abatement. Obviously, farmers had their interest in terms of growing crops, and the bird interests and the waterfowl interests and the wetland interests had their own desire in terms of what the what the managed outcome was to be. So this is to bring it all back to the current process we're engaged in. And the core message I want to impress upon you all is simply that there are viable, sustainable solutions for the Klamath project. I've referred to these as low-hanging fruit. I think this project, to put on my editorial cap for a moment, has been captured in conflict, both internally and externally, for much of its history. And as a result, a lot of this quote unquote low-hanging fruit simply hasn't been pursued. The counterpoint to this this core message is the fact that we have to actually collectively envision a future, and this is true for my constituents, for folks, the different organizations we work with, conservation organizations we work with. It's true, I think, collectively for the basin as a whole, is to envision a future with a diverse landscape, with diverse resources and diverse values that are all collectively as best can be met. And you know, with that vision, to have the willingness and the fortitude to follow through on it. So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about a process, and I could have talked and had this whole presentation just be about water quality regulations and how this process fits into TMDL compliance. And I think that's an interesting story into itself, but I will just say this is a process that is born out of the TMDL compliance process. And I would credit Clayton Krieger first and foremost with being the brainchild of this process. And what the vision is for the Klamath project to engage in a process that will look at how we can, to put it into broad terms, take our operations and become more environmentally sustainable, particularly with respect to water quality, which we can most directly influence. So the process we're envisioning is a planning process that will look at what opportunities and avenues exist to achieve these type of multi-benefit objectives. And that's going to begin with a stakeholder assessment that I suspect folks on this call will be participants in to some extent. We're working on as a companion piece, a stewardship charter that would govern how the different entities and organizations involved in this process participate and collectively make decisions as a group. We're also obviously we need there's got to be a robust technical component to this process, both from an environmental sciences standpoint with respect to water quality, as well as obviously a wetland component from a wetland science component. And I would also add engineering from just a moving water standpoint, aspect. And this is ultimately, hopefully, to result in a quote unquote stewardship plan, which will be part of the districts and the various entities, including Reclamation and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, part of their effort, their part in addressing water quality in the Klamath Basin. We're real quick just to kind of give some kind of general idea of what we're envisioning and what we're carefully clarifying this process is not. You know, this is designed to be a stakeholder and a water user led process within the Klamath project, looking at what options that we can influence, what activities we can influence. I include particularly Fish and Wildlife Service as part of that definition of a quote unquote water user as we see them as part of and one of the Klamath project water users. Obviously, as noted, it's intended to achieve multi-benefits. We recognize, and the reality of today is projects don't get funded. They don't get support. They don't get the regulatory hurdles cleared unless they can show those type of multi-benefits that ensure that all interests are benefited from particular proposals. So yeah, restoration in terms of wetlands, when we talk about multi-benefit, this as we saw on the map earlier, was a system dominated by wetlands. And so if we're talking about restoration of the natural environment and natural ecosystem in the Klamath Basin, just from a biological standpoint, from an ecological standpoint, that obviously has to include some wetland component to it. Water quality, as noted, we have, particularly on the Lost River system, a direct ability to influence water quality, and in other areas lesser of an ability, but obviously to the extent we can, we want to have that as a key component. Irrigation, obviously we're an irrigation organization and irrigation based, and we see the benefits both for our members, but also for society in terms of producing food that we can all get in the grocery store. And of course, we're open to others. And I think there's a potential for a major fishery component here, particularly when we think about what's going on at Gone Fishing and Tule Lake and Clear Lake, which I'll talk about briefly in a second. We think this is a real solution. We're not looking for something that we can just turn some dirt with or put some money towards. We want to see real solutions in the basin that don't just involve more of the same. And I'll let you all fill in the details as to what that is in your own mind. It is partly federally funded, and I'll briefly mention that here in a second. It's not, in terms of what this process is it's not, I tell our folks, this is not going to be the solution to going back to the good old days, or for irrigating all 230,000 acres of the project at full bore. It's also not a complete answer to restoration and a complete answer to environmental sustainability within the Klamath project. That's the other side of that coin. I mentioned Fish and Wildlife Services' role in this. Reclamation has a role in this, but obviously it's water user intended to be water user supported and sponsored, because we think those are where the real solutions come from. And obviously, there's a lot of moving pieces in the basin right now. A lot of big efforts underway, and we're just frank and recognize that this effort is not going to, while it may assist in these efforts, it's not dependent upon and not tied to some of the larger restoration efforts that are underway in the basin. This is just a reality. To put it more directly, this process has independent value, no matter what happens with respect to fish in the basin. These are efforts, just like going back to what happened in the 1930s. Things that need to happen, should happen, in order to better manage the resources that we have available to us. So just briefly, I'll note some of the connection to the other processes that we have on this front. Farmers Conservation Alliance is working with our districts on a district modernization process that this effort parallels. We look at their effort as at the district level, and this effort as basically at the project level. Ducks Unlimited is also working to get money for a sump rotation study that would look particularly at Tule Lake and how Tule Lake can be re-engineered and reoperated to not just have what currently exists out there, at least when there's water, which is a stagnant open water body with intermittent wetland habitat around it. So that effort we see as coinciding closely with this effort. And there's some other efforts that are also, being discussed. Klamath County is talking about one. Obviously, the IFRMP is a process that has been underway, is underway, has a lot of concepts and ideas that are part of that overall plan. And this, at this point, is not truly part of it. So could anticipate, obviously, parallels to that. Funding, I'll just note, we've got ODQ is assisting in this, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then Bureau of Reclamation. So the process itself is just getting started, really, in effect. We've been obviously preoccupied with several difficult water years and a really uncertain regulatory environment in terms of what the Klamath project is required to do from an environmental compliance standpoint. So we've been largely responding to that, in my opinion, last year since my arrival. But I think we're getting to a point where we can make that shift. So anticipate you hearing more about this in the coming weeks. And with that, I will end my presentation early and answer any questions if there are any.
All right. Thanks, Moss. Let me just check the chat here. I don't think there are questions in the chat right now. Oh, here's one. Ken Sandusky asks, do you think there will ever be an opportunity to reconnect the lower Klamath floodplain to increase upper basin water storage capacity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about what we're trying to do, frankly, we're talking about restoring lower Klamath and Tule Lake as functioning water bodies. Now, obviously, they're diked, they're celled, they're connected by pipes and pumps and tunnels. Recognizing all of that, they functioned as part of this landscape, providing services to wildlife, providing services to the environment in terms of water quality and other benefits. And that's effectively what we envision. Just really quickly, I'd note the concept that we're seeing this parallel with, and one you hear sometimes on the waterfowl conservation front, is working lands. This is a landscape that's obviously been altered, which has been engineered. The next slide I was going to show you was looking at all the different ways we can move water around. It's going to continue to have canals and drains and pumps, but we think there's a way where we can manage this system to achieve multi-benefits that provide a greater benefit to the basin as a whole.
Okay. Desiree Tulos asks in the chat, thanks, Moss. This sounds really promising. Can you tell us a little bit about what the process will look like? Some kind of brainstorming, planning meetings, specific studies, something else? And will the broader community be invited to any meetings?
Yeah, on all those fronts. So we mentioned earlier, we have a stakeholder assessment that will be that we're funding and will be run through Sacramento State through the collaborative and collaboration and consensus program run out of that school. And then we have we're anticipating having Maya Singer, who is obviously on the call today, on behalf of Stillwater Sciences, providing the technical environmental engineering support on particularly the water quality and the wetland component of it. In terms of the actual planning process. The plan itself will be, obviously, as I noted, stakeholder developed, and then once we get into an actual plan with concrete specific projects that have been identified, it will be a more formal appraisal and then kind of feasibility level public process. These are almost certainly going to involve federal lands and federal dollars. So it's going to be the full suite of environmental compliance, NHPA, NEPA, ESA as necessary. So anticipate all those avenues for public participation.
Cool. And another question from the chat from Dave Webb. Can you talk to the level of commitment currently among water users to embark on something that may not yield much of benefit to all of them if it entails more water in the stream?
Well, I think the commitment is real. Our folks are looking for real solutions. Obviously, there's the politics and the litigation fronts that entities and individuals continue to pursue. But as noted earlier, those are essentially what everybody's been doing for 3 decades now. And here we are today with a desert of a landscape for our basin, with the irrigation communities hurting, the refuge interests hurting. We think there's a better way to manage the system than we currently are. So definitely anticipate that we're committed. Some of these changes are already occurring, as we'll hear in a minute. Entities in Lower Klamath Drainage District in particular, and we're working with Ducks Unlimited and Fish and Wildlife Services funded a part of it already in the recent bill funding, are looking at how and are already undertaking recycling operations within that area. Same with Tule Lake and Tule Lake Irrigation District. For as long as that district has existed, their modus operandi has been to keep water out of their district to avoid pumping it and to avoid the risk of flooding. Their perspective is changing as their groundwaters drop and they no longer have wildlife in their drains and in their communities are drying up. So these changes are already occurring. I think this planning process is trying to make sure that those efforts, those practical efforts that are already underway, common sense efforts, essentially achieve the greatest benefit for the greatest number. That's the concept in a nutshell. It's already occurring. Let's just figure out how to do it in a way that makes the most sense.
Okay, great. And one last question from Nick Jocelyn. Am I remembering correctly that Klamath Water Users Association was not in support of dam removal? Oh, and we're trying to convince the Siskiyou Board of Supervisors to further oppose dam removal. Or am I mixing up the two different groups?
We've been neutral on dam removal. I think is the fair way to characterize it. This is a process that obviously has a lot of baggage and history to it. Dam removal was tied at its hip to water management in terms of the ultimate solution to water issues here in the basin. And certainly we can all recognize that dam removal is proceeding, but we don't have any solution to how to manage water in the Klamath Basin. So I think we feel, and everyone else has to recognize, that there is still a missing piece in the basin. And until that gets resolved, we're going to continue to have these issues. That being said, that's where we're at today. But dam removal is, it is what it is at this point. A lot of those fights, I think, personally, in my opinion, are in the past, and now we're prepared for that future, is I think a fair way to characterize it.
All right. Any other questions in the room? All right. Well, Moss, thanks for the preview. I'm looking forward to the details.
Thank you.